Welcome again, everyone. My name is Wendy Cooler, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member of Sandy Spring Meeting in Baltimore Yearly Meeting, and I serve as the convener for the Friends Incubator for Public Ministry. If you've been following our blog these past months that we've existed, you know Tom is a regular contributor with his short lectures on various Quaker public ministers throughout history, recently doing a series for Thanksgiving on why we should be thankful that we don't live in 19th century Quakerism. Um, and I want to give you a sort of lengthy introduction to Tom because he's so great. He deserves such a lengthy introduction. Tom is a lifelong friend with roots that go back to the beginnings of Quakerism. One of his ancestors signed George Fox's death certificate in 1691. He is a native of Newcastle, Indiana. He went on to Indiana University. Hold on a second. My thing is um, in Bloomington for his PhD in history, which he completed in 1985. After teaching for 2 years at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. Um, sorry, I'm having a hard time um, with my lengthy introduction, Tom. Anyway, um, he is um, he has written extensively. Um, He has written extensively on Quaker history. His dissertation became his first book, The Transformation of American Quakerism, Orthodox Friends, 1800 to 1907. He received the Brewer Prize of the American Society of Church History for Best First Book in American Religious History. His other books include God's Government Begun, The Society for Universal Inquiry and Reform, 1842 to 1846, Earlham College of History, 1847 to 1997, The Quakers in America, and um, I'm going to put this somewhere else so I can read it to you.
Enjoy.
Um,
Yeah.
and Liberal
Overview.
Quakerism in America in the long 19th century, 1790 to 1920. He edited Quaker writings, 1650 to
I'm
1920.
going to take a
He has
bath.
also been the author
I'll
of
take a shower
numerous
and then I'll
articles.
come and check. See if you need more coffee.
And book chapters, with 4 different chapters currently in press. He has completed a book-length manuscript on Hicksite Friends in the 19th century and is currently at work on a project on Quakers and the Civil War and a collection of the writings of North Carolina friend Mary Mendenhall Hobbs. Tom is an active friend, serving as monthly meeting clerk and recording clerk of Indiana Yearly Meeting, and he is now the presiding clerk of the new Association of Friends. He has spoken at numerous Quaker venues, including Friends General Conference, and is currently serving on the board of Friends United Meeting. He was book review editor for Quaker History from 1990 to 2020 and has served on the editorial boards of Quaker History and Quaker Studies. From 1993 to 2011, he was a member of the Indiana Library and Historical Board, serving as president from 2001 to 2011. He has also served on the Pendle Hill Board, including 3 years as assistant clerk, and he is currently a trustee for Earlham College. Tom and his wife, Mary Louise Reynolds, live in Richmond, Indiana, near the Earlham campus and across the street from the West Richmond Friends Meeting, where he is now a member. So Tom is a very busy guy. Um, Let me pull you back up. So, I'm sorry, I'm having technical difficulties here. Um, there, I'm back. It's so good to record all of these technical difficulties. So, if you've been following our blog and Tom's short lectures for that they always begin with me saying, "Good morning, Tom." And who do you have for us today? So today I will say, good afternoon, Tom. And who have you brought for us today?
Good afternoon, Wendy and friends. And this afternoon, I am going to give you a very brief overview of roughly 375 years of Quaker ministry, which, since I was aiming to speak for 30 to 35 minutes, that means I'll have a little under 1 minute for each decade. So, I think I should immediately get started here. What I want to do is to look at some common themes that run throughout the history of the idea of Quaker ministry, what it is, and who does it, while also looking at divergencies that have developed, particularly over the past 2 centuries or so, um, following the classical Greek pattern that early friends doubtless would have deplored. I'll be dividing this into 3 parts. First of all, the first 50 years or so of Quakerism. Then, secondly, what we usually think of as the era of Quietism from roughly 1690 to 1820. And then finally, the development of modern Quaker diversity over the past 200 years. As I assume all of you know, early friends in England in the 1640s and 1650s saw Quakerism as being nothing less than primitive Christianity revived. Nothing more than that, nothing less than that. Preaching was central to sharing that message and that understanding. And part of that vision of a revival of primitive Christianity was reviving what early friends thought was the true meaning, the true understanding of ministry. And I'm going to be focusing on spoken ministry. I think today we probably would share a conviction that writing can also be a form of ministry. But for early friends, ministry was seen basically as preaching. Although, certainly, we need to keep in mind that early friends were prolific writers, and just about all of the most important early Quaker authors were also public friends or ministers. At the heart of early Quakerism, of course, is George Fox, and an opening or revelation that he saw as absolutely central to the development of the Quaker movement was the idea that ministry is something that comes directly from God. Ministers are not created through ordination or apostolic succession or the laying on of hands, or least of all, through education. Instead, ministers preach, teach, minister because they are directly inspired by God to do so. And one of the things that isn't always clear in early Quaker understandings of ministry is the extent to which that is guided by one's sense of the light within, and how much that is guided by the direct leadings of the Holy Spirit. But certainly central to early Quaker worship, early Quaker understandings of ministry, is the idea that direct communication between God and human beings did not cease with the writing of the last book of the Bible. Indeed, the same Spirit that inspired the writings of the Holy Scriptures still is accessible to human beings. That meant that all could be inspired. All conceivably could be ministers, whether male or female, highborn or lowborn, literate or illiterate. And one of the things that Fox was adamant about was that ministry, true ministry at least, was not the product of education. Fox and other early friends engaged in extensive debates with Puritan and Presbyterian and Anglican clergy who were in the ascendancy at the time. And Fox was scathing in his characterization of them. They speak a divination of their own brain, and not from the mouth of the Lord. And such the Lord sent his prophets to cry against. All those now who study a divination of their own brain and speak not from the mouth of the Lord, we do deny. And all who are made ministers by Oxford and Cambridge, bred up with learning, and so made ministers by the will of men, and speak natural languages, as Hebrew and Greek, and say that the original which natural man may learn, and the natural man knows not the things of God, and all such we do deny. Uh, Fox drove this argument home in one case with a New Testament example, pointing out Paul was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel in the Jewish religion. But that did not make him a minister of Jesus Christ, for he declares that he was not made a minister by the will of man, but by the will of God. Fox was equally clear that no true minister of Jesus Christ would preach for pay, that since the leadings of the Spirit were freely given by God, so they must be freely shared by those who receive them. He was scathing in his denunciation of those, quote, priests must be covetous and strikers and hirelings, when Christ tells you that a hireling will flee and leave the flock. By these doings, the flocks are plucked almost to pieces by the hireling shepherds. So, in short, Fox was very clear that he thought that most of the clergy of his time were not true ministers because they depended on education or ordination or churchly status for their standing in the ministry, rather than acknowledging that their only ability could come directly from God. Very early in the history of the Quaker movement, certainly it's clear, by the mid 1650s, came the idea of a public friend. And friends like Fox and other friends, his contemporaries that we would think of as outstanding ministers, such as James Naylor or Edward Burrow or Elizabeth Houghton or Margaret Fell, were more often known as public friends rather than Quaker ministers because they felt called to public witness, to public ministry. That meant preaching in just about any setting they could find. Of course, by the mid 1650s, friends are building or leasing or otherwise acquiring their own spaces for worship. But public friends will preach virtually anywhere that they can find a group of people who are willing to listen to them. By the 1660s, 1670s, you're beginning to see a formalization where certain friends are recognized and acknowledged as being public friends, and that they have organizations or special meetings of their own. For example, by the 1670s, you have what's called the Second Day's Morning Meeting in London, which was a conference held on Monday mornings of public friends who happened to be in the vicinity of London at that time. And one of the functions of this group was that they sort of decided, all right, which of us should be at which meeting in the next week or month. So even then, you have a bit of coordination. We certainly have some understanding of what these public friends were saying from their published writings. It's clear that they usually reflect what these friends are preaching. We also have accounts from the journals and correspondence of these friends. And finally, by the 1680s, rather late in the early period of Quakerism, we begin to get transcripts of at least a few Quaker sermons. Friends would have refused to write out sermons in advance. That would have been anticipating what the Spirit might lead them to say or do in a particular situation. But people in England being enterprising, by the 1680s, you have shorthand stenographers who are coming into friends' meetings, taking down what they hear from friends like Fox or William Penn or other well-known ministers, and publishing that in pamphlet fashion. Uh, Friends had doubts about that, but of course, we're grateful that it gives us some sense of what Quaker preaching was like. Historians generally agree that with the passing of the last of the first generation of friends, like George Fox and Margaret Fell in the 1690s or the first decade of the 17th century, that we're entering into a new period of Quaker history, what's usually referred to as the period of Quietism. That label comes from the conviction you see shared in Quaker writings, reflected in Quaker correspondence, voiced again and again in Quaker preaching, that the foremost duty of friends is to be absolutely passive in working out the will of God, in doing what God wants done, of being so suspicious, so aware of the dangers of the human will, the human desire to build oneself up or act in one's own wisdom. Every desire, every inclination in that direction must be suppressed. The goal of Friends is to be absolutely quiet, absolutely passive, awaiting the clear leadings of God through the light and the Holy Spirit. By the 18th century, the term public friend is falling out of use. And more you see references to friends who are ministers or friends who are engaged in ministry. You know, it's not like some yearly meeting decided we're going to use this language instead of that. It seems to be one of those things that simply happened. And I think it would be an interesting study if somebody could trace, and I would guess that, now with the software that's available, you could probably count the number of references in Quaker writings between 1700 and 1800, public friends versus minister. At any rate, that idea, or at least that label, is changing. Nevertheless, there is strong continuity with the understanding of what ministry is with what friends of Fox's generation had believed. First of all, ministry must be completely inspired, completely led by the Spirit. Indeed, most friends who are recognized as ministers would have considered it getting ahead of the Spirit to give any previous prior thought to what they might say in a meeting for worship. You even find a few cases where friends record that a particular idea came to them on the way to meeting, and they took that as a sign that they should not speak about that idea, since they couldn't be certain that it was a divine leading. Certainly, friends continue to be distinctive because they believe that women have just as much right to speak and preach and pray publicly as men do. And indeed, one of the things that seems to have attracted non-Friends to Quaker meetings for worship, and there were usually, especially in urban areas, some non-Friends who are drawn to Quaker worship, is the novelty of a woman preacher. And some of the best known 18th century Friends ministers are women. And Friends continue to believe that ministry is not the product of education. An illiterate Friend by the 18th century is almost unknown. But the idea that you could study for the ministry or that ministry would benefit from book learning, Friends would have seen as a repudiation of the authority of the direct leading of the Spirit. Nevertheless, over the course of the 18th century, you see some developments which formalize the status of ministers among Friends. By the 1730s, the idea of recording has emerged. In the 17th century, it was generally understood and recognized who public friends were, who the friends were that had a gift in the ministry. By the 1720s, 1730s, however, you have developed first in London yearly meeting, then very quickly in the American yearly meetings, what are called select meetings. These are meetings for business held separately from the regular monthly or quarterly or yearly meetings, which are attended by friends who are recognized as having a gift in the ministry, and also by the elders of the meetings. By the 1720s, London Yearly Meeting is requiring each monthly meeting to designate male and female friends who are charged with the oversight of the ministry. They are not ministers themselves. Instead, they are to be supportive of friends who show a gift in the ministry, and also, quite frankly, to silence friends who are not speaking to edification. And sometimes their methods can be rather severe, to the extent of, on at least one occasion, having a lecturing friend physically carried out of a meeting house in North Carolina. In order to be clear about who had the right to sit in these select meetings or meetings of ministers and elders, the idea of a formal recording, a formal recognition that someone has a gift in the ministry, becomes common practice by the mid-18th century. Nevertheless, the choice of verb here is very important. Friends do not ordain ministers. They record them, or more technically, they record that a certain person has a gift in the ministry. 18th century Friends ministry tends to run along three lines. The most common of these is sharing a message that the friend speaking perceived as given to him or her to share in a particular situation. So an example, this is an otherwise obscure Friends minister from Wiltshire named Thomas Bevan, but who nevertheless summed up very nicely what he thought ministers did. As prayer is an address of the soul to God, so preaching is an address of it to men. And as that is performed acceptably to God by the influence and operation of the Blessed Spirit only, so this is performed profitably and beneficially to men only by the illumination, help, and power of the same Spirit. In vain are all the studied, elaborate, and eloquent discourses or sermons which proceed only from the mere activity of human reason about the things of God and the exercise of the soul towards Him. For as religion is a divine science to be learned only savingly by the illumination and dictates of the divine spirit in our souls, so it is to be taught others only to edification and salvation by those inspired from heaven. Men that would teach religion must themselves be first taught of God, must go to Christ's school, must come under the discipline of his Holy Spirit in their own hearts. Second function of ministry was speaking to the conditions of others. And the lines between this and a specific message to be shared with a specific meeting isn't always clear. Some of the best examples of this would be found in the accounts we have of the preaching of John Woolman, his own accounts of how visiting a certain place at a certain time, he was led to share a message with them that turned out to speak to the condition of individual friends there, particularly on subjects like slavery or peace or the simplicity and moderation that should be characteristic of Friends. The least common form of ministry, but one that was greatly valued by Friends, was a prophetic ministry, one of stern rebuke of the shortcomings of Friends, or one that seemed to foresee the future. Good example of this is Vermont minister Joseph Hoig, who in 1803 had a vision that he often shared with friends. In the year 1803, I was one day alone in the fields and observed that the sun shone clearly, but that a mist eclipsed the brightness of its shining. I said to myself, what can all this mean? I do not recollect ever before having been sensible of anything like this. And I heard a voice from heaven say, this thou seest, which dims the brightness of the sun, is a sign of the present and coming times. I took the forefathers of this country from a land of oppression. I planted them here among the people of the forest. I sustained them, and while they were humble, I blessed them and fed them, and they became a numerous people. But now they have become proud and lifted up and have forgotten me. They are running into every abomination and evil practice of which the old countries are guilty, and I have taken quietude from the land and suffered a dividing spirit to come among them. He goes on to prophesy that a great war will come to the United States in which the wicked institution of slavery will ultimately be destroyed. Joseph Hoig himself died in 1846, but Friends remembered this, of course, in the 1860s when the Civil War came. Most of all for Quietist Friends, what they fear is acting in one's own will, sharing words, speaking not directly led by the Holy Spirit. We have very few written works by Friends of this period, specifically on the subject of ministry. Probably the best known of these was by Friend Samuel Bonus, an Englishman, in 1750. He gives all sorts of good advice to friends who feel called to ministry. For example, cautious conduct and deportment to avoid spreading rumors and gossip and to shun worldly pride. But most of all, he exhorts them to avoid preaching in one's own will. It is no more lawful for us to preach what we have read because we have read it than it is for us to preach what we have heard because we have heard it. A spiritual minister is and ought every day to be like blank paper when he comes into the assembly of the Lord's people, not depending on any former openings or experience, either of his own or others that he hath heard or read, but his only and sole dependence must be on the gift of the Spirit to give and bring to his understanding matter suitable to the present state of the assembly. This is an understanding of ministry that just about all Friends would have shared 200 years ago. But over the past 2 centuries, we have seen considerable diversity develop among Friends, and so understandings of ministry have also diverged. These, of course, have their roots in the separations that began in the 1820s, with the minister Elias Hicks of Long Island reaching the conviction that far too many Friends had been corrupted through their connections with non-Quakers and the world, and so a reformation was necessary. Thus, we have Hicksite Friends. The Friends that Elias Hicks was criticizing, the Orthodox, united in believing that Elias Hicks was misled, but they themselves disagreed on what an appropriate response was to the shortcomings they perceived, both among Friends and in the larger world. A majority of Orthodox Friends would follow the lead of the English minister Joseph John Gurney, who both in his preaching and in his numerous writings argued that Friends needed to be recalled to biblical authority and the necessity of a distinct and definite new birth. A minority of Orthodox Friends, however, who found their foremost spokesman in the New England minister John Wilbur, thought that Gurney's vision of Quakerism was in its way just as corrupt as that of Elias Hicks, and that any deviation from the old primitive ways would lead Friends astray. Finally, in the late 19th century, we have appear among the Orthodox majority, the Gurneyite Orthodox majority in North America, ministers like David B. Updegraff of Ohio Yearly Meeting, who argued that all Christians, Friends included, were called to two definite instantaneous experiences. The first, the new birth or justification, the second, sanctification or holiness. And we should not fear any method taken from any source which led sinners to salvation, that Friends should work enthusiastically with non-Friends in bringing the message of salvation to non-believers. And so it is that a century later, by the year 1920, you see the Quaker world divided along the lines of pastoral Friends, the heirs of David B. Updegraff's Holiness Revivalism, and unprogrammed Friends who come out of both the conservative Orthodox tradition and the liberal Hicksite tradition. To make things more complicated, you also have clearly apparent a division between evangelical, often fundamentalist Friends, mainly among the pastoral bodies, and Friends who think of themselves as modernist theological liberals, who are a minority in the pastoral bodies, but are increasingly coming to dominate the unprogrammed meetings. Throughout this period, you see Friends ministers doing many traditional things. You see Friends like Priscilla Cadwallader of Indiana warning Friends that they are straying from the old ways and need to return to them. We see Friends like Lucretia Mott of Philadelphia calling Friends to action to work out God's will in the abolition of slavery, in equality for women, in bringing wars to an end, in understanding that Christianity means not authority for truth, but truth for authority. And all of these friends would have seen themselves engaged in ministry, in sharing God's word with those who are willing to listen to them. Of course, you have had arise by 1920 the pastoral system among friends. How that came to be is a long, complicated story. Suffice it to say that it's an outgrowth of the David B. Updegraff type of revivalism of the late 19th century. If you want my more extended take on that, you can read my first book, The Transformation of American Quakerism. And that leads to changes. It leads to a recognition that a pastoral ministry does require some sort of education or training. That certainly, I think that all evangelical friends would agree that the best forms of ministry are those that are inspired by God. But pastoral roles usually need some sort of education. First, friends depended on Quaker colleges to do that. Then they increasingly turn to Bible colleges, which in turn sometimes become four-year colleges. Finally, in 1960, you get the Earlham School of Religion as the first explicitly Quaker theological seminary with this function. Pastoral worship means usually an end to the old ways of leading worship and also a subordination of elders. But the role of ministry in a pastoral meeting is, of course, absolutely clear. In unprogrammed meetings over the past century, we have largely seen, not in all yearly meetings, but in most, the abolition of the idea of a recorded ministry, doing away with an understanding that certain people should be recognized in a special status as ministers. And one of the ironies of this is that those who tend to be most insistent on the idea of all friends having an equal right to engage in ministry are friends who are highly educated. They may object to the idea of a pastor with theological education, but it has been the pattern of the development of North American Quakerism over the course of the 20th century that the overwhelming majority of new unprogrammed friends meetings have been set up in college and university towns and appeal to the highly educated. Certainly, um, my sense of Friends ministry today is that there is anxiety about it. In the pastoral Quaker world, there is anxiety because there never seem to be enough friends coming forth with a call to pastoral Quaker ministry. In the unprogrammed world, there is a concern, I know in many meetings, about the nature and quality of ministry. A concern that ministry is more than simply sharing one's ruminations on what you read in the New York Times that morning. And I think that Wendy's project is a product of that. Well, I have gone for about 37 minutes here, which is a little longer than I intended, but as I said, it's a mile wide and about a millimeter deep. I will now invite questions, comments, impassioned rebuttals, whatever you feel led to.
Thank you, Tom. That was charming as usual. I'm going to send you a little emoji um, and invite other people to give you some emojis of affirmation if they would like.
Aw, thank you, friends.
Hmm. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, friends. Um, well, um, We have a question in the chat, and I'm going to encourage friends to continue putting questions in the chat for me to share with Tom. Um, I have a question, Tom, unsurprisingly. Um, so I know that there's kind of scant, from past conversations with you, sort of scant evidence from which to conjecture about support systems amongst early friends. Um, but I think clearly they existed. Otherwise, early friends would have died.
Mhm.
Some of them did, but not of poverty. Um, so I'm wondering what you do know, what you can speak to, or what you might conjecture from what you know about early public friends and how they supported each other, given that they were against a sort of compensation model for ministry. What did that look like?
Okay, well, I think you can think of support in two forms. The first would be simply making a living,
Hmm.
because you know, a lot of early public friends like George Fox were single young men or women, and presumably they were depending on family for some sort of support. You know, we have reason to think that George Fox's family was relatively well off,
Hmm.
and they were certainly willing to make sure that he was fed and clothed and had a horse to ride, things like that. But in the case of somebody like James Naylor, who was a husband with a family, a farmer, I'm not sure anybody has explained, how his family avoided falling into dire poverty other than that other friends were supporting them, were making sure that their basic needs were met. And when the system of monthly meetings, begins to develop in the 1660s and 1670s, that becomes one of their clear functions. When friends feel called to travel in the ministry to make sure that they have the resources to do that. And if friends fall into hardship or poverty, it is the responsibility of their monthly meeting to make sure that their needs are met.
Hmm.
So that's about as much as we can say. In terms of spiritual support, here Margaret Fell is absolutely central because until things start shifting toward London after 1660, Fell's home at Swarthmore Hall is a kind of Quaker headquarters. She coordinates correspondence among, dozens of traveling friends, where they are going, where they next expect to be. I have been thrown into the Launceston jail. I am going to need some help here. So that's important. But when you look at this correspondence, the so-called Swarthmore letters that have been preserved, much of this is spiritual exhortation. Keep the faith, follow your leadings, be obedient to the Spirit. Okay, we got lots of questions in the chat now, so I'll just go down through them. Can you speak to ministry versus evangelism? Well, certainly early friends would have seen evangelism as a form of ministry, an extremely important form, probably the most important form for them, because they would have seen themselves called as evangelists to recall people around them to primitive Christianity. Quakerism was primitive Christianity revived. Preaching that message, sharing that word is probably the most important thing that they could do. By the era of Quietism, friends have relatively little interest in actively trying to seek new members. Throughout the Quietist period, there are always some convinced friends coming in, But it's not like you had in Fox's day where you have friends preaching in the marketplace to share the Quaker message. They're drawn in other ways. Um, with the development of Gurneyite Quakerism, and particularly revivalism and pastoral Quakerism, evangelism is seen as a very important function of preaching, but not the only form of preaching. That, there is such a thing as a teaching ministry, a ministry of exhortation, a ministry of comfort, which is entirely legitimate, but is not necessarily evangelistic. Okay, may I ask your personal opinion of current day recorded ministers, ministries, and unprogrammed meetings? My life among friends has been largely in programmed meetings, but I have been part of unprogrammed meetings in, let's say, Bloomington, Indiana, Indianapolis, Morgantown, West Virginia, and also visiting them. And, my experience of ministry there was very limited. For the most part, those meetings were usually silent. And when ministry did take place, it was usually along the lines of sharing concern about something bad going on in the larger world and a hope that friends would do something about it. I would not want to generalize about all unprogrammed meetings on the basis of my limited experience. Let's see. Have you seen Swedenborgianism make inroads on Quaker ministers? The answer is no, at least not to my knowledge. From time to time, you run across 18th and 19th century friends who encounter Swedenborgians, but they invariably consider them to be misguided. Somebody like Lucretia Mott would have thought that, if you really are led by the Spirit to be a Swedenborgian, that's fine. But I think for her, there would have been far too much book theology involved. Do you feel that Optograph was as influential as Gurney in the 1800s? I think they were both extremely influential in the direction that Gurneyite Quakerism takes after 1830. And it's important to keep in mind that Gurneyite Friends are the majority of North American Friends from the 1830s right down to the present day. Until the early 20th century, the Gurneyite vision of Quakerism dominates London Yearly Meeting. And certainly Quaker missionary work, the development of Quakerism in Africa, in Latin America, and Asia is almost entirely in the Gurneyite tradition. That is supercharged by revivalism, the development of pastoral Quakerism, the kind of Quakerism that David B. Optograph advocates. So I would say, in a lot of ways, Optograph is Gurney's heir, and Optograph saw himself as Gurney's heir. Could you share more about the role of elders in recognizing and supporting ministers and how that has changed over time, especially how the word elder, whether noun or verb, has changed in its usage and acceptance? Okay. As elders were originally intended in Friends meetings, they were charged with oversight of ministry. As I said earlier, good elders encourage friends who are coming forth in ministry, who are speaking to the edification of others, who are showing promise as ministers. And you have lots of accounts from 18th century, 19th century ministers about how caring, nurturing elders helped them develop in the ministry. One thing you see in the accounts of Quietist ministry is how terrifying it was for ministers to speak for the first time in a meeting. There was this fear that maybe they were getting ahead of their leading, that they would embarrass themselves or their families. A good elder would sense that and encourage a friend to follow his or her gifts, his or her leadings. Um, it was also the function of elders to discourage friends who were not speaking to edification, to tell them that it would be best for them to keep silent. Now, um, until the late 19th century, uh, Friends meetings would also have had yet another class of officials, Friends who were called overseers. And overseers were charged with the enforcement of the discipline. It was their duty when they became aware that a friend was departing from the discipline of friends, was not using the plain language of thee or thy, or had been attending worship led by a hireling minister, or had gone to a dance or had a musical instrument in their home. It would be the duty of the overseers to call on that person, ascertain whether there was legitimacy to the complaint, and then bring a report to the monthly meeting. And then the monthly meeting would decide how to deal with this. And very often, the process that the overseers began would end in disownment, the loss of membership. Um, it's clear that sometimes overseers thought that simply having a word with an offending friend, telling friend Ruth, it really is a bad idea for you to go hear that Methodist preacher, even though I know you have Methodist friends. That's a kind of eldering in contemporary usage, I think. My sense of eldering among contemporary friends, though, very often means speaking to a variety of kinds of perceived misconduct. Maybe most often what somebody is saying or doing in meeting, but it can extend to other areas as well. And so I really don't get the sense that elder becomes a verb among friends until the 20th century. Would you have an idea of the size of program versus unprogrammed meetings? Which version has more members in it? Among North American friends, there are about 80,000 today. I think something in the neighborhood of 50 to 55,000 are in pastoral or program meetings. Uh, 25 to 30,000 in unprogrammed meetings, whether independent or conservative or part of Friends General Conference. Worldwide, the overwhelming majority of friends are pastoral friends, especially in Latin America or Africa or Asia. In fact, I think the only region of the world where unprogrammed friends would be in a majority would be in Western Europe. And there, of course, Britain Yearly Meeting would account for the overwhelming majority there. In current times, might it be possible that there are friends called to be ministers that are staying silent about their callings and working quietly in the background across unprogrammed meetings, or is that naive? I think that it is so. I'm not sure how I would go about proving that conviction. This friend goes on to say, I think this may be the case in the UK in the last 100 years or so. My experience of Quakerism in the UK has been limited to half a dozen visits. So I really can't speak with much authority there, but that's just my sense more than anything else.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Um, Actually, can I take a crack at that question, Ruth?
Please, or if other friends feel led to.
Um, yeah, before other friends unmute themselves, I do want to stop the recording for your privacy. Um, but I think yes, Ruth. I don't know how much you know about the project that has sort of gathered us here, the Friends Incubator for Public Ministry. But it's our contention, and it has overwhelmingly borne, it seems to be true in a way that overwhelms us, that there are countless friends in the world, not just in the United States, that are really called into a public facing ministry, who do not know or have not known until recently that we have a tradition of public ministry in Quakerism. And their meetings don't know it, which is how individual friends don't know it, and that there is a taboo about calling oneself a public minister, or behaving in a public way with your call to ministry. And in the last couple of years, I mean, work has, as you heard, there's this rich history, and then practices of support and accountability died away, and it eventually became taboo. I think right now it might be taboo because so many people have spiritual wounding and trauma from past experiences of religious community, and the language of ministry is triggering to them. And so it's been difficult to kind of move forward in that conversation. And then a few decades ago, there was an enormous amount of work by public ministry, Friends in Public Ministry, to promote the idea that we could reclaim these practices. And then on the foundation of that work from 20 or 30 years ago, we now have efforts like the Friends Incubator for Public Ministry that are laboring with meetings about, reclaiming these practices, reclaiming this identity as a people where we are all ministers. And also, some of us are called into more of a public facing ministry. And I see some of our fellows here today, but we have not publicly identified them. But we recently went through a discernment process of choosing 5 fellows to work with for 2 years on their public facing ministry with their meetings. Um, and for those 5 spots, we had almost 60 applicants. And it was an international response to that. So, all evidence points to the reality of friends being called into public facing ministry, and there being a sort of renaissance among us in terms of claiming that and building structures for that. All right. Tom, you have more questions.
Yes.
I
Uh,
you can take a break. I will read it to you.
okay,
It's okay. I can be helpful.
go ahead.
Do you have any idea what the early friends would think of friends meetings today? Would they recognize us as friends?
Well, that is certainly a loaded question. I don't know the answer. My gut answer is no, that they would find things to deplore in just about every variety of contemporary Quakerism. Um, and the question is, to what extent are the things that they would find unacceptable, whether it be a paid ministry or musical instruments, or the fact that in many meetings a clear Christian identity would be a subject of dispute? To what extent are those evolutions that preserve the essential spirit of Quakerism, and to what extent do those reflect declension or degeneration? And a lot of the arguments that take place among Friends today come from which side of those questions you would place yourself on. Maybe George Fox would feel comfortable at Chestnut Ridge meetings south of Barnesville, Ohio, where the men and women still sit on, different sides of the meeting house. But beyond that, I'm not sure.
Thank you, Tom. Um, so there is a thank you to all of us for working to change our culture around public ministry. Thank you. And there's a comment. Some Quakers enact public ministry with projects of peace, such as anti-militarism, working against fascism. There are tax resistors, voter registration, and so on. Yes. And then we have a question. Do many Quakers not know how it is actually named the Religious Society of Friends? I hear Quakers so much from everyone that makes me wonder if some think that's the actual name.
Well, of course, there are friends in the world today who refuse to use the label Quaker, particularly among evangelical friends, because they say that friends is scriptural. You know, Christ said, I have called you friends. Whereas Quaker is a word that nowhere appears in the Bible. Therefore, they have tried, very actively and consciously to move away from the label of Quakers. And of course, there are also many friends who, have given up the idea of the religious society of friends. That, in fact, is a name that Fox would not have recognized. It's an 18th century creation to describe Friends, that they were clear that they were not the Friends Church, but Religious Society of Friends is something that gradually was adopted, which doesn't make it any the less legitimate. And in fact, one of the points of contention among Orthodox Friends in the late 19th century was between Friends who continued to refer to themselves as being the Society of Friends and the yearly meetings that officially changed their name to Friends Church.
Yeah. And there's a follow-up question about meetings for sufferings. Do any of our USA yearly meetings have meetings for sufferings? And I would ask you to consider, Tom, whether we have something like a meeting for
Right.
sufferings.
Well, Meeting for Sufferings originated in London Yearly Meeting in the 1670s, I believe, to do exactly what the name suggests. Friends were facing persecution, friends were suffering, they needed to be relieved. So, Meeting for Sufferings was set up, first of all, to coordinate relief for friends, that, friends who had members in prison would be given aid, that they would be given advice on legal counsel. Meeting for Sufferings would also send petitions to the king to have friends released from jail or have fines remitted. They'd also send petitions to Parliament to have persecuting laws repealed. Over the course of the 18th century, as toleration became the law on both sides of the Atlantic, yearly meetings still had entities that they called Meeting for Sufferings, but they essentially functioned as an executive committee. This is the group of appointed representatives who could act on behalf of a yearly meeting when the yearly meeting wasn't in session once a year. By the late 19th century, on this side of the Atlantic, the name of Meeting for Sufferings has usually been changed to something like the representative meeting, or sometimes an executive meeting. I think it was the conservative yearly meetings here in the US that held on to the label of Meeting for Sufferings the longest. But in Britain Yearly Meeting, it has continued right down to the present day. And I would assume that there are still occasions where it acts in some way to relieve the sufferings of friends. I would assume in cases where friends have been arrested and jailed because of various forms of political activism and public witness.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm going to turn the recording off now. And if you have words of affirmation or just chatty questions or things to say, we will end at 30 minutes after the hour, so about 20 minutes from now. But after I turn the recording off, we really welcome you to unmute yourself.